This time of day is kind of hard. You don't know whether to say good morning or good afternoon because it's kind of in the middle, so I'll just say good day. I am William Carrington. I'm a jack of all trades. I've been a computer graphic artist, a graphic designer, a production artist, a shoveler of horse poop, and in 2011 I decided to become a sculptor, so I'm now a sculptor. But I'm here today to be the moderator for the discussion today with Katie Robinson Edwards, and we're looking very much forward to what she has to say. And let me give my formal introduction. Katie Robinson Edwards, PhD, is the curator at the Umlauf Sculpture Garden and Museum in Austin. In addition to curating exhibitions and writing on Texas art, she has written on Chuck Close, Jackson Pollock, Robert Rauschenberg, Jessica Stockholder, Andrew Wyeth, and Jamie Wyeth. Previously, she taught at the Albritton Art Institute at Baylor University, where her interest in Texas art was sparked by a Texas mid-century art exhibition that came to Baylor. Her book on mid-century modern art in Texas was published in 2014 by the University of Texas Press, and she's contributed to the catalog for this current exhibition. She has served on the Cassetta Board of Directors since 2010. For those of you in the audience who are uncertain what Cassetta stands for, it stands for the Center for the Advancement and Study of Early Texas Art, which is proof again of Katie's depth of knowledge in the subject. At the conclusion of the event, be sure to head over to the May Center where Kenny Braun and author C.S. Gwynn will be presenting. And let's give a warm welcome to Katie.
Thank you, William. And it's been a great pleasure to meet you on the internet and now in person. And just so you know, you heard that he has a new sculpture here at the Witte, and you can actually see it from this window. So we'll talk about that, but afterwards be sure to go out and have a look at it. And I'm going to set my timer so we have, because we want to moderate and actually have a Q&A a little bit with William, myself, and the audience. So I'll try to move through it pretty quickly. I just wanted to say, well, two things. The first is that this has been an absolutely spectacular symposium. Those of you who have been here since yesterday, it's unbelievable, the quality and the level of things that they're doing, that we are doing. It's a huge group of people, and I think the audience questions are really helpful to it. So I'm really proud to be part of it, very pleased with the exhibition. But I'm also a little bit peeved because I really hate that I would like to go be hearing Light Cummings and Sue Canterbury right now, two of the most impressive people of all time, and I can't believe that this happened. I almost wish we could all just move over there, and then we'll have a fireside conversation later. They are, yeah. They will, and actually that's happened to me and all of us several times. I bounced back a little bit, and I won't be offended if anybody walks out to go catch up on them, seriously, because that's what I would do if I weren't standing up here in front of you. I won't leave on you, though, William. So this is really wonderful, very happy to be part of it. Hard to believe that this exhibition, it wasn't quite 5 years in the making, maybe more like 4. But please all get your catalog when it comes out. It's 420 pages, I'm pretty sure. It'll probably weigh about 6 pounds. So I wanted to start a little bit just to quote some great people who've written on art in Texas and sculpture. And Susie Khalil, in her Texas Landscape book, she actually walks everyone through William Getzmann's theory of why Texas artists did not generate as many visual records of the Texas terrain. Reasons such as no artist could penetrate the vastness of Texas by river. There is no scenic Oregon Trail, no Rockies, no railroads, no public lands. And Khalil rephrases Getzmann's challenge by saying that Texas artists could not pictorially arrest the sheer territorial expanse or encapsulate the diversity. In other words, it was too large and too diverse for the wandering artist. And so, Khalil writes, the key to development of art in Texas was the emergence of diverse cultural environments, smaller cultural environments, which is what made art thrive. And what I also want to say, and I write about this in the essay for the book, and of course Susie would agree, is that they are also, I feel like artists have a bit of freedom in Texas. They take an inward turn, and they have a little more subjectivity in some cases, and they have a little bit more liberty. And of course, this happened a lot with the GI Bill too in the mid-20th century, when universities begin to hire artists and they have a little more freedom to make what they want. And if you can't tell, I'm a modernist, so we're going to get there pretty quickly. Light Cummins' article that is also in the book for 250 Years of Texas Art, he says, even before the arrival of Europeans, Native Americans living in the region practiced rudimentary forms of manipulating images in stone. Their petroglyphs, carvings on rock, may still be found today. And we just saw a great example in J.P. Bryan's talk. And as Cummings points out, unlike easel painting and watercolor, for example, sculpture also has a clear-cut memorializing function that often involves public placement and out-of-doors display as part of its civic purpose. So that's one thing that sculpture does that is different. And yes, of course, and we'll see a lot of this as well, artists make smaller works that adorn homes, offices, and museums, and these sculptures come into the personal collection of people. And then sculpture accelerates with the arrival of Spanish settlers, who bring with them the well-established artistic link between Roman Catholicism and the making of carved statues of saints, altar retablos, and church art. And sculpture for these new Texans, of course, had profound religious significance, and as such was vitally necessary to their spiritual life. That's Light Cummins' writing. And in fact, I will argue that sculpture always had profound religious significance, even when the religion is removed or not apparent, religious or, let's say, spiritual content to it. And it retains profound visceral, spiritual, and evocative power. On the very most basic level, sculpture functions in 3 dimensions, and thereby demanding a fuller response from the viewer. Now, I don't actually believe this, that sculpture is preeminent over painting, but I need to make that argument today. It has, for example, the haptic power that extends beyond the visual, and this is what a lot of people will say about sculpture, and you'll see that in just a second. I know you're going nuts because there's no pictures up there. But today we will make the argument that even modern sculpture retains that spiritual, haptic, full body sense. And we've actually lost a lot by putting sculptures in museums. We've lost a lot of that ability. You know, it used to be something that you could go into a church and you could actually touch and pray by touching, especially in the Roman Catholic tradition. And now we don't allow people to do that. There's a great story that James Elkins tells about his grandmother coming in from the old country and going to the Metropolitan Museum, the medieval art section, and wanting to touch everything and getting yelled at for trying to touch them. And she's completely flabbergasted, because that's what you're supposed to do, is hold on to these things and feel that haptic power while looking. You're engaging the vision as well as the haptic, the tactile sense. So just a few things. When I titled this 3D states of being, and I'm not just talking about the artist living in a 3D sense. It's actually something that, as viewers, we need to become attuned to as well. So it's also our state of being to start understanding why 3 dimensions is so important, how we relate to it with our bodies. And I also should say, we are just touching a fragment of artwork today, and not even necessarily the most important ones, simply because we have a short amount of time, and there's certain points I wanted to make. But what I put up here were some of the purposes of sculpture: memorial, religious, social and political, sensual abstract, nature reconfigured, some of the ways that it affects us, and of course some of this also applies to 2-dimensional arts as well. And then up here you've got, I don't even need a pointer, but you've got Elizabeth Ney's image of Stephen F. Austin here. You have Gene Owen's Shiva, and this is actually James Searles's Death of Saint Sebastian. And they're not exact. I didn't really get my geography right, but I imagine that Stephen F. Austin covered this part of the terrain. Fort Worth, where Gene Owens is from, is somewhere here. And this was actually, this wood was found in Splendora, which is somewhere here. So we're roughly touching on where these sculptures relate. And these will come up later. And so will some of these themes, not all of them. But sculpture has had a long, it's had to defend itself a lot. Charles Baudelaire famously wrote an essay about why sculpture is boring in 1846, that has nothing to offer, that it's just a literal representation. And of course, he was a great modernist and very interested in modern fashion and modern painting. And then Herbert Reed comes out in 1946 in his lectures, and he makes a defense for sculpture above other arts, saying that the specific plastic sensibility is, I believe, more complex than the specifically visual sensibility. It involves three factors: a sensation of the tactile qualities of the surface, a sensation of volume as denoted by plane surfaces, and a synthetic realization of the mass and ponderability of the object. He took a lot of flack for that, but he makes a very strong case for why sculpture is preeminent, as if we really need to argue back and forth. And then just 10 years later, we get Ad Reinhardt, the great whimsical abstractionist, saying sculpture is something you bump into when you back up to look at a painting, which I think a lot of people in the ETA world still believe this, and it does happen. However, in this image from the School of Guercino, one of Guercino's students or followers in his studio does this etching of a blind man with his cup and cane touching a sculpture, and he's not bumping into the painting, he's probably just about to kick it instead, because of course it means nothing to him, he cannot see it. But what's wonderful about this is look at the sculpture that, look at the sculpture that he's touching. She's responding, you know, and this reminds me of a kind of a dirty story. We all know about the early Aphrodites, the beautiful, the Venus de Milo. Picture her, beautiful Greek sculptures that ended up being armless. But Praxiteles did the first Aphrodite on some of the islands in Greece, and it was actually the first nude female that had ever been made in antiquity, because it wasn't, you know, they were making nude men. But around 350 BC, he makes a nude female figure, and there's actually, he actually makes, it gets moved. It's on one island, they don't want it, so they move it to the island of Knidos, and it's the Venus of Knidos. And the legend is, and you'll read about this in ancient texts, the legend is that sailors would stop by the island of Knidos and get very friendly with this sculpture in the most physical way. And so when I heard J.P. Bryan getting kind of excited about that drawing of Tom Lee's wife, I thought, oh boy, you need to go see this Venus. And our one, just picking and choosing some of our great sculptors, Elizabeth Ney, whose name has come up so many times appropriately. There she is in her studio in Hyde Park, Austin, that you can definitely go visit. Coming over from Germany, as JP said, because they wouldn't let her sculpt nude men, and so she comes over here, establishes herself, and makes some of the most luscious, delicious sculptures that I'm sorry that you can't touch them, but there is a portrait of her and a portrait of her philosopher husband, Edmund Montgomery. It was very important that Elizabeth Ney, and notable that she did not change her name. That's one of the things people talk about. She was a real leader, very much wanted an art department at the University of Texas. Sadly, she did start the Fine Arts Association, but sadly she passed away before that ever happened. She died in 1907, and the art department at University of Texas at Austin was founded in 1937, but she definitely led the charge on that. And there is one of her portraits of Sam Houston. And I want to skip quickly to Pompeo Copini, who we've heard wonderful, I don't know about wonderful things about, but an absolutely incredible presentation by Richard McCaslin yesterday about Copini. This is Littlefield Fountain. So this is at the base of the southern end of the University of Texas campus, very famous fountain. And it was originally, when George Littlefield commissioned it, it was originally supposed to be a Confederate monument. There was a disagreement between Copini and Littlefield. As McCaslin said yesterday, Copini essentially won because Littlefield died and there wasn't much he could do. So it became a memorial to the University of Texas students and the alumni who died in World War I with a very strange iconography. So this is, or strange to us, because it's old-fashioned. This is Columbia, the figure of Columbia, which represents the United States. And then these are these 3 hippocamps, these mermaid horses with 2 mermen riding them. And then Columbia is flanked on either side by a sailor and a soldier. And this fellow, I mean, talk about luscious quality here. Looks like a Chippendale fellow. Unfortunately, the condition of this, it needs a lot of help and a lot of work because it's hard to be in a fountain. But really a pretty spectacular piece. And originally it was planned to be much bigger. It got pared down. But this is what it used to look like in 1933, and this is what before the Paul Cray Tower came up in 1936, roughly with the centennial. This was Old Main Building, looking a lot more like Georgetown University, right, than University of Texas. So that building only lasted about 30 years, 40 years before they took it down and built a new one. But here was, and the fountain used to be much bigger too, and extended much further. And then so it's serving a memorial function. But the other thing, and this will come up in Q&A, I'm pretty sure that Dr. McCaslin said these were cast at Roman bronze works. They had to be. But let me know if I'm wrong. I'm sure they were. Which was Roman Bronze Works was the foundry in New York, and it was the first foundry in the United States done in the lost wax traditional classical ancient Greek style. And it was actually opened up by an Italian, ran for many years. They cast so many pieces by Remington, too many in fact, it got them in trouble. Charles Russell, Charles Umlauf, everyone was casting there, and that's where Copini was casting this, because it is an enormously laborious process, and we might get into that later, but I don't think we're going there today. So that's the Copini Littlefield fountain, and his great student, Waldine Tauch, won Ranger bronze. She was his student and essentially became his adopted daughter, and as we learned, or as we may know, is buried near him with Copini and his wife. She stuck with him. That was one of the rules for him teaching her how to get into the trade, is that she would not marry and that she would stay with him. And then Alley Victoria Tennant's Tejas Warrior, made for the 1936 centennial. There she is with it. And it is so wonderful that they got that small version here. And if you want to think about the haptic power, I mean, you can't touch that piece. Maybe you can't touch it, but it is the scale model is absolutely luscious. That's in the gallery just over there. And one thing about it that I think is this is so large and it's up above, it's monumental, it's public art. You can't get up and get close to it and imagine it quite in the same way, but having something in a scale model that you can get close to is absolutely delicious to see that, and the surface of the bronze is spectacular. And we also have in this exhibition Dorothy Austin's noggin. Dorothy Austin had quite a reputation, was doing very well, had actually shown in New York in a major exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art when they highlighted art from 16 different cities. And then this was purchased by the Dallas Museum of Art. And I had always thought it was maybe an African-American subject, but it's probably inspired by Olmec tradition that she saw. And so she models it after that, and it has these absolutely incredible striations that create the hair, closed eyes. And it's in white pine. They were so pleased that the DMA lent it. It's not actually made out of one piece of wood. This is the Depression era, and wood is expensive. And something new that I've found that they've actually got online is you can flip it upside down and see underside it's got at least three pieces of wood, and she talked about that. She said it was just too expensive, so she put them together and then carved it. And I'm sure you will go back and look at it more closely now, because you can actually see the lines along the side of the cheek, the lines where it's put together, and then she, for something that is so beautifully geometric, she makes it look seamless. Really incredible artist. And hard for me not to think of this Florence McClung. I love, who doesn't love these women artists of the 1930s, these regionalist artists, where Florence McClung is also gaining a reputation, particularly in her drawings and prints, for replicating the land, which uses geometry because it's efficient. It's an economical way to farm, but that also becomes a hallmark of some of these works, that becomes a visual hallmark, that those lines that repeat on. It also gives a sense of infinity, which I think this does as well. So I just wanted to put those two together. And for this exhibition, there's a wonderful Mabel Fairfax Carl, which I have to say I know very little about, but it's absolutely gorgeous, and it actually appears to be out of one piece of wood. So take a close look at that. It's also really nice and gratifying to see a naked woman by a woman artist, which you'll see maybe about a 0.1% of sculpture of naked women is actually by women. And the Dallas Museum of Art also generously lent this Black Serpentine Lead Belly by Michael G. Owen. He was in New York when he made it, and Lead Belly was apparently singing Goodnight Irene during the creation of the clay model, and then Michael turned this into this piece. And I wanted to say something else, that so he made a clay model and then he carved this out of serpentine, but he didn't make multiple copies, and he didn't really use a pointing machine to do this, because Michael Owen, Mabel Fairfax Carl, and Dorothy Austin, among many others, were really struck by the idea of what's called direct carving. And that may seem kind of like a no-brainer, because if we picture sculpture, we picture a block of wood, and we think, you cut away things until it's revealed. But that's not actually how it was done, and it's not how Rodin did it. It wasn't until Constantin Brancusi in around 1906 started to say, I want to work directly with the work. I don't want all of these scale models. I don't want a pointing machine, and I don't want to let assistants carve my work, which is what Rodin's marbles were carved by assistants. Nothing wrong with that. That's the way it was done. But it is a much more hands-on approach to sculpture. And so that's what Dorothy Austin did, and that is what Michael G. Owen often does, and Mabel Carl. And I can't, we're moving along pretty quickly, but we're doing great. I've got 15 minutes by my own accounting. I cannot give a talk without bringing in Charles Truett Williams, just one of the greatest artists of Texas, who was from Texas, studied at Abilene Christian, then went to war, essentially, and left, and also was in Paris with the Army Corps of Engineers from 44 to 46, actually, when Paris was liberated, went and met Harry of Harry's Bar, and was a sculptor through and through. And that's another thing that there are certain artists who flip back and forth between painting and sculpture, 2D, 3D. Somebody like Charles Umlauf and certainly Charles Williams, they are sculptors. They see in 3D, and that is how they work. I think it's the same thing, well, with a lot of them, with Jim Love. Certainly with Copini, right? So here is Charles Williams in the early 60s with Gene Owens in the Bronze Foundry. And this becomes, because Charles Williams is in Fort Worth, there becomes a whole school of people who learn how to cast. They go to salvage yards. They acquire objects and then they weld them together. So they're not only casting bronze in the old style, but they're also doing these new kinds of assemblage works that are very different. Again, very modern, something where you are really using contemporary techniques and contemporary tools and new kind of machinery to make art out of, which again is something that is unique in a way to sculpture. And these are two early gorgeous pieces by Charles Williams, this Torso 1949 on the left, and then Continuum 1951. So this is in limestone, and this is in walnut. But you can see what the impact of being in Paris and seeing all of these artists firsthand did for him. It forever marked his work. And then he comes back, he makes a little stop in Atlanta, and then comes to Fort Worth. And I just have to say that Carl Williams is in the audience. Thank you, Carl, for being here. His son is right here. And raise your hand, please, because people might have questions for you. Thank you. And has actually been so helpful to me as I've looked at Charles Williams. And there's so much more work to do, actually. And he would have essentially parties, salons, teach everybody how to work and have them in his studio. Gene Owens said, though, that when he first got here, when he very first got to Texas, he did not know how to cast when he first came in from this is Gene Owens, from University of Georgia, and then comes to Texas. He doesn't know how to cast, can't find anybody to teach him. I don't know if he hadn't found Charles Williams yet or they were in different places, but Gene Owens just figures, where can I go? And he comes down to Austin and he takes summer school classes unofficially with Charles Umlauf so that he can learn the art of mold making. And Gene doesn't remember the year that he did this, but he said that Umlauf was very generous with him, and after the normal class, then they would have a whole separate independent study about mold making so that they could then cast from it. And then Gene goes back up and spends all his time with Charlie, because their aesthetic is quite different, as you'll see if you don't know already. Another piece, and this won the 24th Annual Texas Painting and Sculpture Exhibition in the 62, Ancient Warrior by Charles Williams, which is again a welded iron and steel piece put together. But it's very different, and when we think about what sculpture does, it has this kind of totemic, ancient quality to it that makes it extra powerful, I believe. And in my book, I compare it to this photograph of a Zuni war god. You're not supposed to photograph them. This actually used to be in the Brooklyn Museum of Art, the actual object, the Zuni object, but it was repatriated, so now it's back. And that was actually from the catalog for the Totems Not Taboo exhibition, which was this amazing exhibition that Jerry McKeague did in Houston to show Houston the primitive objects, and she worked a lot of contemporary art into that show as well, at least a few objects. I think that Charlie Williams, who was helping with that show a little bit, and his friend Jack Boynton was actually helping to install it, I think that Charlie Williams saw that piece and it lodged in his memory through the power of that work, and then made that Ancient Warrior. He also was influenced by Henry Moore. Henry Moore, in turn, was influenced by Central America and Chichen Itza with some of his forms, which also Charlie Williams saw. So there's Charlie Williams' odalisque hammered bronze at the Ridgely Country Club, and there's Henry Moore's reclining figure, which actually I think is still in Palm Springs in the Weiner collection. And we have lost a lot of these artists. I'll show you a lot of living artists. But one thing you might notice in this big exhibition of Texas art is that we were restricted to living artists, which was good and bad, right? Because there are great artists that couldn't be included, and then there were artists who got included and had died prematurely, so it was sad to have them in there. And I'll show you, sad and good to have them in there, but we wish they were still making art rather than being in this exhibition of deceased artists. But one of the artists who's a great artist is Gene Owens. You saw a photograph of him earlier, but here are some of his very abstract works that he was making. And Owens was actually Isamu Noguchi's studio assistant for several years and would go to New York and work with him, but always wanted to come back to Texas. He did not like the New York life so much. He found it a little, I don't want to say shallow, but it was hard to get his work done. And of course he was working for Noguchi there, and he had a huge influence on a lot of pieces that Noguchi made. Noguchi tried to get him to come with him full time. He didn't want to do it, and he still works today, probably right this second, because I think that's what keeps Gene going, up in Cleburne, Texas, just south of Fort Worth. And here are some of his early works. But in terms of what sculpture, oh yeah, and this is a later work that he does too. He gets into some kind of jocular things. But in terms of sculpture, this the reason the slide looks bad is because it's actually from a photograph made at the time. I don't know where the piece is. It's actually physically from a slide that Gene Owens had. But one of the things that Gene still revels about sculpture and about the casting process, and these are traditionally cast, is that there is a moment after you make your mold and after you melt your wax out. I don't know, they'll all do the purpose, but after you melt your wax out and you've got this ceramic shell, in this case it's probably in two pieces, it's probably a front and a back, although with those big Copini pieces there are dozens and dozens of pieces that have to come together, but this was probably done as a whole. So at that moment, after you melt the wax out, before you put the molten bronze in, Gene absolutely revels in the fact that there is nothing there. It's like a Zen experience, that what is going to be a sculpture is filled by an empty cavity. And he still gets excited and gets a twinkle in his eye if you talk about that, because it is a moment of becoming. And I find a lot of times that's, with art and with sculpture, that's one of the most exciting moments, when it's almost in the process, which is also, I think, why people in general are interested in process. But it's this moment of going from nothing to something, through the hot molten bronze that gets poured into it. And one of the people in this circle was also the late Ed Storms. This is his Slithy Tove, which is from Jabberwocky. It's a Lewis Carroll derived image, but I had never really thought about it before in conjunction with that Gene Owens, because formally they're so similar. And this piece is about this big, also in cast bronze. And what I consider one of Gene's greatest pieces of all time, a Parturient Machine in the 1960s, cast bronze. He is very skilled, needless to say, and is always trying to figure out how to make things work together. And so the arms of this piece bend over, and you can put it in different positions. And when we had it in an exhibition years ago at the Umlauf, 4 years ago, believe me, people would come through and reshape it and put it in whatever position they want. And it looks like, sort of like an insect. Parturient machine means a birthing machine, essentially. I find it a very positive piece. That I showed you that Shiva image earlier, that tiny image. Gene is very interested in non-Western cultures and the positivity of the female form and female goddesses. And when I saw this, I was so struck, and I put this in the book too, because it really is quite the opposite of the incredible Alberto Giacometti work that's at MoMA, which is Woman with Her Throat Cut. And if you're it's basically an insect with its wings that has been killed, and you actually can see the nick when you go and see the real piece, Woman with Her Throat Cut. And I was pretty sure it was conceived of in 1932, but it wasn't cast until 1949, quickly went into the Museum of Modern Art collection. And I'm pretty sure that Gene Owens saw that. He can't quite remember, but he knows the work, saw that, and it lodged in his memory somehow. And I consider his work, Parturient Machine, to be very similar, but a very positive kind of work instead of as negative. Now, this is not the typical Giacometti that you all are picturing, the tall, skinny figures when you picture Giacometti, but this is him in his most surrealist period. And I also think it's interesting that, so 1932 was his real surrealist period, but then it wasn't cast until much later. And then MoMA has it on a big plinth. It is still a shocking work when you walk up. You need to go see that piece. And then try to go see Gene Owens' work. It's in a private collection. unfortunately. Hopefully it'll end up in a public collection so that you can see this piece. But the piece that I really love that I had never seen until yesterday is Eveline Seller's Praying Mantis, 1947, almost definitely cast at Roman Bronze Works. I had seen photographs of this. It had been in there's a couple of versions. I don't quite have it figured out, and there's a slightly shrunken version that's just a little bit smaller. But the piece that we got for this show is from Gwen Weiner's collection. It had been in Palm Springs for a long time. So I was just ecstatic to see this, because when you look at it, you can see the praying mantis with all of the little markings and all the little bodies on all the parts on the carapace all lined up. And I definitely think it puts both of these works to shame, just rising up this powerful praying mantis. You know what a praying mantis does? She eats the head off of her mate so that she'll get a little more, get more babies, let's say. Very powerful female form made by a woman artist. And something else about Eveline Sellers is that when we get to Charles Umlauf, his great Spirit of Flight commission, which I hope many of you know because you've been through Dallas Love Field and have seen the great bronze, on the 17-foot bronze on a 22-foot plinth and an enormous water fountain with 18 birds flying around it. That was a really big commission for Charles Umlauf, and he had on his contract, he had to say who would pick it up for him if he died, and he picked Eveline Sellers. You know, if something happened to him, she would be the one that he would trust to finish that commission. Fortunately, he was able to finish it. And Roy Fridge is another of these artists who is from this group around Charlie Williams, including Jack Boynton, Jim Love. Roy Fridge, Jim Love, and David McManamay were like the unholy trio from Port Aransas. And he never talked about sculpting. He actually called it whittling. He actually talks about whittling, and this is a piece that actually Carl Williams has because it was a gift to, or purchase, or gift, I'm sure, or trade to Charles Truett Williams. Really beautiful little piece that has a lot of totemic power, but is also a tabletop piece. And then David McManamay, we were able to secure this Jomo board for the exhibition. Please go look at it closely. McManaway, who had named these Jomo boards, which he is most famous for, because he'd seen this old movie called Juke Girl, I think, Juke Girl, and it had a guy in it who's peddling, an African-American guy who's peddling what he calls his Jomos, his little good luck charms. And, sorry, I keep hitting the wrong button there. And there's a lot of things in here to see, but one of the wonderful things right here is this paintbrush. This is a much more sculptural work, and this paintbrush that he's essentially ossified and lacquered, because it's really not, it's not a painting, it's a three-dimensional piece in here. Jack Boynton, who we know in the exhibition through Solar Temple, also made sculpture. Jack Boynton out of Houston, but starts out in Fort Worth and studies with Charlie Williams, and made this incredible small piece about this big, Identity being consumed by its own offspring. And I want to skip through, because that was my own little personal timer. There's Charlie Williams with Jim Love, acting goofy here. And Jim Love's area code, tried to get this for the exhibition, did not, but instead we got, well, this one is the one that you'll see in the show. But one of the things that you can see is the strong influence of David Smith on Jim Love here. So these, you know, Texas artists, and this is a big argument I always make, they were very aware of what was going on in the world and very thoughtful, and then bring it back an area code to something that is specifically local, with all of these Texas themes throughout it from all the different regions, area code of the state. And then Witch Doctor, again, I talk about this in my book, but I think it's really important that a lot of these artists, they're making whimsical pieces. This is something that he was doing when he was scrounging salvage yards with Charlie Williams and coming up with objects and then reconfiguring them and welding them together, and which is a very new thing. A lot of artists, like Charles Umlauf never did that, although he could, chose not to. But he ends up making this work that he calls Witch Doctor, which I realized is actually based after a Bugs Bunny film, which is Witch. And because that is pretty much a racist cartoon, Nickelodeon won't show it anymore, you don't get to see it, and Warner Brothers would not give permission to use that. And so I had my husband do a drawing so that you could actually see some of the formal similarities of Bugs Bunny acting like this witch doctor. But what does that tell us? That tells us that a lot of these images come from popular culture, and let's not forget that. I mean, we could do a whole riff on that, a whole conference about the popular culture connection between so much of Texas art. And I completely agree with J.P. Bryan that we don't want to lose the history of the state, but this is the history of the state as well. And Charles T. Williams, again, doing what a lot of artists don't do, but making these, this is 4 sculptural objects. This elephant is really adorable. These small pieces that are welded out of found objects, but just having that vision in that eye to turn them into something new, almost shamanic, totemic, very powerful new objects that are actually based on new materials, or relatively. A lot of these by this time are 50 years old, right? A lot of things. Jim Love's Honeymoon we have in this show. I was struck by how, I don't know why I hadn't thought about it until just a couple months ago, because we have this James Searles show at the Umlauf, and we've got this work continuous, and I realized, oh, of course, Searles was from East Texas, but did a lot of his work in Houston. And of course, this is what you do if you're making an eye and you want it to have this supreme power, make it pretty simplified, but there's obviously a heavy Jim Love influence on James Searles. I have to remember to ask him about that. There's James Searles and a very different one. The whole film Jackalope actually deals with the creation of this one. And Charles Umlauf, just showing you a couple things. We'll whip through these kind of quickly. This is the one that was selected for the exhibition, reclining figure. And these are all cast. And there he is working on the Spirit of Flight in Italy, 1959 to 1960. Sometime I think we really need to have a whole sculpture conference and talk about the process, because people are so interested, and we just don't have the luxury of getting into how it happens now. But you can see, I'll just tell you that Umlauf, when he discovered Italy, which he discovered because of this commission, he only had $60,000 to make that commission at Dallas. That wasn't enough money. He went to Roman Bronze Works. They said, well, we could at least give you the main figure for $60,000, but those 18 birds with their 6-foot wingspans, forget it. So he learns that he can actually go to Italy and work there for much cheaper. He still needed an extra $10,000 to get it made, though, to get that made, which now, of course, seems ridiculously cheap because the bronze is worth more than that. Primitivings, we'll kind of skip through that, but that's Charles Umlauf on the left, Charles Williams on the right. Octavio Medellin, you've got this in your exhibition right here in the Witte. Big San Antonio period, also very good friends with Charles Williams, but also we need to touch a little bit on what's not included in the show. There were some great talks yesterday about that. I'm so glad that I'm talking about this in terms of Medellin being from Mexico and experiencing a kind of otherness in Texas, which we can't get into too much, except that most of Texas art really is made by white male artists, and then we need to start expanding and finding these other objects. And I'm so glad that a lot of attention is coming into the women. There's been a lot of work done on the African American artists and the Hispanic artists, but there's so much more work to do. And Medellin was in Americans 1942 at the Museum of Modern Art. They're the works that were in that show. And keeping on this theme of what's not included in this show, we really needed to get a piece by Carol Sims, who was John Biggers's colleague at Texas Southern University. Carol Sims, we didn't end up getting a piece, but I'm so glad that the John Biggers mural is the largest piece in there, and what a great artist. But Carol Sims also worked for years at Texas Southern University and actually was the first African American graduate of Cranbrook, the great Cranbrook Art Academy. And he went there and it was segregated, and so even though he could take classes there, he couldn't spend the night there until, he talks about this in a video, until one of the kids, one of the obviously white kids, smuggled him in and had him spend the night in his room so that they proved that nothing bad happened. So eventually they could get him a room on campus. But I've recently talked to a number of the early students who integrated the University of Texas in the 50s. And even though it was great that they could suddenly go to school, they couldn't eat in the same restaurants on campus. They certainly couldn't stay. They were actually staying at Houston Tillotson in Austin. More Carol Sims at TSU. Jesus Morales, who tragically made it into this exhibition with this gorgeous vanishing edge round, which is in granite. Morales insisted on working in granite, a very difficult material to work in. It's sad because he died way too early in a car wreck, which is how he ended up in the show. Wonderful that we have him in there. And there is, so this is a small, something you could own in your home, and this is one that you hopefully will go visit. The Memorial to Houston Police Officers, 1990, that is like a step pyramid here, and then four inverted pyramids, and of course it also happens to make a cross shape as well. His piece at Rockport Center for the Arts. Are you flashing it? Okay, thank you. I can hear it. And then Searles's Death of St. Sebastian. James Searles is still alive, but is one of our greatest sculptors of the United States. There's James Searles with this work, which we actually have in the Umlauf right now, and Christopher Gongalas, the owner. But again, talk about sculpture that has this incredible power and also religious significance and also sexual, obviously it's a big phallus, right? Sexual significance. It has many, many meanings, and the eyes can mean so many different things around them, but including all of the people who have been martyred, but it's also direct references to Saint Sebastian. We think he was killed by arrows, but he was actually clubbed to death because he was nursed back by a woman after he had been shot by arrows in Diocletian's time. And so this piece, in many ways, has multiple readings, as any good artwork should. Luis Jimenez. I don't have a good image of this because I actually didn't have access to ours, but we showed this. But this is his sod buster. There are 5 castings of them. Most of them need to be restored. We showed one that was in beautiful shape. But I just put this in here because look at the face of that guy. It's a reference to the early people who created the breadbasket of the United States. So he's thinking about all the indigenous people all up and down the center part of the country who helped to create the United States of America. And he's looking at Michelangelo. So here is the Jimenez drawing, and he's looking at Michelangelo's God, and then he incorporates that right back into here. So you've got this layering of all this meaning in this piece. And that's that we've got the small border crossing here in this show. The large one is at the Blanton Museum of Art. Please go see it. And Melvin Edwards. You may not know who he is. I hope you do. But he was from Houston. He went to high school in Houston. He went to Wheatley High School. He played football. And then he went to University of Southern California, which has gotten a really bad rap recently. But he went there and made sculpture, and always made sculpture. And I want to get to this quote. Well, here's the quote. Sculpture seemed to me a more direct way to deal with the inner subject. It allowed me to put in a more natural way things that people were saying you weren't supposed to put in art, like race and politics. It allowed me to think more literally in those ways. He talks specifically about why sculpture was a better form for him. And what does he put into it? Well, he has a whole series that he starts in 1963 with Some Bright Morning of what he calls lynch fragments. And they are gorgeous pieces. They are welded, often found objects, but they have different kinds of implements both of incarceration or enslavement as well as freedom. And there are many, many of them. Okay, pay attention to Melvin Edwards. There was a great show at the Nasher of Melvin Edwards. They're all supposed to be about 6 feet high. Michael Tracy, don't forget about him. These are artists who are still alive, as is Melvin Edwards. Sharon Capriva. Ken Little, I put that because he's from San Antonio. And the most wonderful Isaac Smith pieces. Sorry, we're going so fast. I'll send you my PowerPoint. Frances Bagley, Linda Ridgway, Sherry Owens, a lot of great artists, and there's a lot of great, and William Carrington. And we wanted to end on these. I didn't even know about the javelina actually at the time, but let's let William ask a question, and I'll stop there.